So in reality, it's even worse. So what could fix this problem? Well, you could not use hydrogen. That would fix the problem. If you're talking about using hydrogen, your fundamental problem is the very first step, which is electrolysis. None of this gray or brown business. Let's get cut the euphemisms. If it's made from
Yeah.
fossils, which 99% of hydrogen in the world currently is, just like it was 20 years ago, it's black because this idea is simple-minded and seductive. It's like solar panels on cars. Hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. We're going to be using it. It's the best thing since sliced bread. It's the most abundant element in the universe. Blah 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 blah. Those guys have basically evaporated 1.3 billion dollars over the past 20 years. They have never made a profit, and almost all of that money came from taxpayers here or there in the world.
I've been following Paul Martin's work for quite some time now, and there's something deeply satisfying about watching someone combine 30 years of hands on hydrogen expertise with a complete immunity to corporate buzzwords. As the founder of Spitfire Research, a name that perfectly matches his approach to debunking industry myths, he's built a career on turning complex chemical engineering into straight talk that makes you wonder why everyone else is trying so hard to make it complicated. As a co founder of Hydrogen Science Coalition and holder of 4 US patents, Paul has made it his mission to cut through what he calls hopium. Think of it as the blockchain of the energy world, but with more periodic tables and fewer laser eyes. When he's not designing pilot plans or saving investors from their own enthusiasm, he's every hydrogen huckster's worst nightmare. A chemical engineer who can do the math and isn't afraid to tell you why your hydrogen powered toaster belongs in the same category as your uncle's perpetual motion machine. Paul, it's truly an honor to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It was a great introduction.
Can't we just bend the thermodynamics?
Yeah, oh, wouldn't it be great? What I've often said to people is that if their thoughts are let's pursue something despite what thermodynamics tells us is true, their aspirations reaching for hydrogen are not high enough. They should be looking for finding a way to harness the 0 point energy of vacuum space or something. And you can plug your refrigerator into God, and have God run it for you. And that would be fantastic. Except, we adults, we have real limitations, and we have to solve problems using what we know. So, and thermodynamics, we know. We don't just suspect.
Yeah. You argue that three times energy efficiency gap between battery electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles is insurmountable. What technological breakthroughs would need to happen in electrolyzers and fuel cells to meaningfully narrow this gap?
So, first of all, the three times is a best case figure. It can be far worse than that. And in fact, there was a paper published in the International Journal of Hydrogen Energy just recently, tracking the performance of a hydrogen refueling station in California that has a small electrolyzer and supplies a small fleet of vehicles and has been running since 2014. The very best they managed to achieve in terms of converting electricity to hydrogen on board vehicles was about 89 kilowatt hours per kilogram, which is about 40% lower heating value efficiency. And in the calculations where people are looking at hydrogen being three times as energy intensive to achieve the same number of miles driven with a vehicle as a battery electric vehicle can achieve, people are using 70% LHV efficiency there, and maybe allowing another 10% for for compression and storage and dispensing. So in reality, it's even worse. So what could fix this problem? Well, you could not use hydrogen. That would fix the problem. If you're talking about using hydrogen, your fundamental problem is the very first step, which is electrolysis. What electrolysis does is basically takes pure exergy, electricity, which you can easily convert into thermodynamic work, and it converts it to a proxy for heat. It converts it to a fuel with a reduced efficiency. So even if you did that step perfectly, you've still taken a huge step backwards in thermodynamic terms. You've converted work into heat. And now converting heat back into work again, well, the fact that you can use a fuel cell rather than an engine is somewhat helpful, but fuel cells themselves have thermodynamic limits associated with them. And fundamentally, regardless of what you're doing in the electrolyzer, you must put in some form, the heat that you get back out of burning hydrogen, producing water, and then condensing that water back, water vapor back to water liquid. And no engine nor any fuel cell will ever capture that 6.1 kilograms, kilowatt hours per kilogram of energy that's just fundamentally lost in that chain. So the answer to your question is there's no fixing it. It's permanently broken. It will always be less efficient than something that doesn't involve converting electricity um, into a fuel.
Very, very self explanatory. How do you respond to claims that new metal organic frameworks or cryocompressed storage could revolutionize hydrogen storage density?
Really easy. So the basic physics of storage are as follows. You can try to get the density of hydrogen storage to increase by absorbing hydrogen onto a surface, or doing what they call chemisorption, where there's actually a chemical reaction that happens, but one that's reversible, where you can heat the material back up again and the equilibrium will shift in the other direction. And all of these things do the same thing. They're all trying to reduce the storage pressure or increase the storage temperature at which you store hydrogen. But the
Mm.
physics are very straightforward. Anybody that's telling you that without basically irreversible um, chemical reactions, that you can store hydrogen at a density higher than that of liquid hydrogen, just isn't really paying attention. They're just not thinking about it properly. And liquid hydrogen itself is only 71 kilograms per cubic meter at minus 253 degrees C, or 21 Kelvin, or thereabouts. So it's not going to fix the problem of hydrogen to be doing these things. And if you do irreversible chemical bonds, you make hydrogen into something like ammonia or metal hydrides or the like, that you have to carry out other reactions or decompose the molecules at high temperature in order to get your hydrogen back. You have now entered into an energy cycle efficiency problem. You've made your energy efficiency even worse than it was before when you weren't doing that. So, yeah, there's no winning here. It's fundamentally bad energy storage medium.
Like now going off the script. The other day, I've seen technology. It evolves to be concrete, and some are used till 100 bar, the other ones till 350, and then there are ones who are called ultra, like for ultra pressure for 1,000 bars and above. Where, where does all of this is going with such, call it technology, but it's huge, it's enormous, it looks scary.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you asking what pressure people are likely to use hydrogen
Exactly. Like,
as a
is it
compressed?
going above 750?
No, and I mean you can try, but the gains that are to be had come at extreme cost. So looking at 700 bar already, that's 10,000 pounds per square inch. So that's about 5 tons per square inch of pressure.
Wow.
Uh, the mechanical energy that's stored in the 5 kilograms of hydrogen on board a Toyota Mirai is approximately the same as the mechanical energy of that vehicle suspended about a kilometer above the ground. That's just the mechanical energy. That's not including the energy, the chemical energy in the hydrogen itself. That's just the mechanical energy. Think of it as a tightly wound spring. And the thing that you're using to store that energy, or that the energy is stored in, hydrogen, happens to be the slipperiest gas there is. It wants to get through and to permeate all sorts of materials of construction. And those problems get worse and worse as the pressures increase. So no, you're not going to be compressing hydrogen to 1,000 bar or 1,500 bar. It's just 700 bar is already absurd. Honestly, we
Mm,
don't use 700 bar hydrogen in industry at all. It's just not done.
yeah. Can you elaborate on why you believe Wright's law won't drive down electrolyzer costs as dramatically as some predict?
Sure. So my old boss at my former employer, where I designed and built modular chemical plants for a living for 26 years, used to refer to things that look complex but are really just configurations of ordinary things as tanks and pumps and stuff. He used a less polite word than stuff. Uh, and electrolyzers and hydrogen plants they consist of an electrolyzer stack, which might embody some technology, and you might build them in an automated factory, for instance, and their price might drop with Wright's law type learnings. But half the cost of a hydrogen plant right now is tanks and pumps and stuff like that. And those things don't get cheaper just because we make more. We've already made too many. Wright's law does not apply. So the only thing
Yeah,
that hydrogen get cheaper at scale is growth. That's the thing that's going to drive it, because the stacks themselves only represent about half the cost. And you can drop them to a tenth of the cost, and you're still stuck with the other half that isn't changing. The only way to get the marginal cost of that, tanks and pumps and stuff like that, compressors and deoxo beds and storage tanks and piping and heat exchangers to reject heat from the electrolysis inefficiency and all of that sort of thing. The only way you can get that stuff to get cheaper per kilogram of hydrogen is to make more kilograms of hydrogen and to make the equipment bigger. And greater vertical scale will help. So projects at 10 gigawatts of scale will make cheaper hydrogen than projects at 1 gigawatt of scale. And projects at 100 megawatts of scale will never be able to compete with projects at a gigawatt of scale. This is a fundamental issue. And the problem is that even when you extrapolate the cost of electrolyzers to what they realistically could ever become, and you make the projects as big as they could ever realistically be, green hydrogen's not cheap enough to waste as a fuel. So there goes your hydrogen economy hyperbole right there. It's just deader than the doornail.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, what's your reaction to massive wave of hydrogen hub funding announcements? Are these fundamentally misguided?
Well, I think we have to break that into two pieces. So the first one is, does it make sense to do hydrogen hubs of some sort? And the answer is, the way the world works right now, we kind of do that, meaning that we don't use hydrogen as a chemical except in applications where we make it on site. And we tend to concentrate large users of hydrogen around one another so that they can draw on multiple steam methane reformers, for instance, so that if their reformer goes down, their whole plant doesn't go down. So having hubs around something that's hard to move and store makes some sense. But the real question is, what are these hubs supposed to be doing? What are the use cases? And this is the key question with hydrogen. And it's really this simple. If there's fossil generation still on the electrical grid, There's no point in even thinking about making green hydrogen because you're not going to make hydrogen that's actually green. The wind and
Yeah.
solar that you were thinking about putting to the purpose of making hydrogen would be better deployed displacing fossils from the grid. That by better, I mean it will give you a lower cost per ton of CO2 emissions averted, and will be better for the environment in general terms. Then once you've done as much electrification, as much greening of the electrical grid as you can, then you have to do as much electrification as you can. So that means getting rid of fossil use in heating and transport. And once you've done as much of that as you possibly can, now you can start talking about making green hydrogen to replace black hydrogen. None of this gray or brown business. Let's get cut the euphemisms. If it's made from
Yeah.
fossils, which 99% of hydrogen in the world currently is, just like it was 20 years ago, it's black. Its emissions are vastly greater than if you just burned those fossils for energy in the first place, which explains why we don't burn hydrogen as a fuel because we make it from other fuels. So again, the hubs thing really goes to use cases, and a lot of the use cases that are being considered, like hydrogen for long distance, heavy transport or the like, there are residual use cases that will eventually go to electrification. So we should really not waste time or money, especially public money, on those bad use cases.
Awesome. How do you respond to arguments that hydrogen infrastructure could leverage existing natural gas pipelines? And this one I have discussed last week with George Verberg. Very interesting opinion he had.
Okay, well, I've written a principal author of a paper in energy science and engineering with Alyssa Ocko and a couple of my colleagues from the Hydrogen Science Coalition, among others. And we took apart this notion for every piece of the natural gas network, from gathering lines from existing natural gas wells and gas preparation equipment out in gathering plants, all the way through the transmission system, the distribution system, to end use devices. We've looked at the whole range. There's problems with all of them, but the most severe problems are with the transmission network, which happens to be the most valuable part of the network. And the problems are intrinsic. They're not problems that you're just going to make go away. And the gas industry is extremely motivated to tell you that they can reuse their network for hydrogen because their alternative is to go out of business. So, of course, they're going to say hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen to anyone who can listen, because otherwise you're going to realize that their assets are actually liabilities with an abandonment cost post decarbonization. They're worthless. So why would you believe a word that those guys say about hydrogen? They're not honest brokers about it. They're extremely motivated to tell you that their network has a future. And let's be clear, it doesn't. Natural gas, hydrogen blended into natural gas, even at $3 a kilogram, which is impossibly cheap for green hydrogen, it's something that's not achieved anywhere today and likely won't be achieved anywhere in the world in the next couple decades, if ever. Even at $3 per kilogram production cost, and ignoring the cost of distribution, just ignoring it, just pretending that there is no cost of distribution, it's still costing $350 per ton of CO2 emissions averted relative to just burning pure natural gas. Add in
Yeah.
those distribution costs, and it's north of $700 per ton of CO2 emissions averted. Or make the hydrogen $6 a kilogram, same deal, $700 per ton of CO2 emissions averted. It is an absolute economic nonsense idea. It's a nonsense idea right up there with direct air capture. It's a non-starter. It's a predatory delay strategy. It has nothing to do with real decarbonization.
And I cannot help to wonder what is their motivation except for the money.
Well, their motivation is to stay in business. Their motivation is to keep doing what they're already doing. And the argument is, well, we have an asset, and that asset must therefore be valuable in the future. Well, I'm sorry, we had an awful lot of assets in the world for maintaining the horse as a mode of transport in cities. There were a lot of people with stables, and there were a lot of coach houses on the back of homes. A lot of people growing hay and bringing it in and carting manure back out of the city when they weren't just shoving it into the river where they could find a place for it. And I'm sure those people said, "Hey, the horse is important to the local economy. We can't get rid of the horse. That would be an absolute disaster." And
Yeah.
wondering whether or not they would be supportive of automobiles. Really? Are you really that gullible? So yeah, their motivation is to stay in business. And you should expect them to be dishonest brokers about this whole thing.
What specific metrics or standards would you propose to prevent greenwashing of hydrogen projects that claim to use curtailed renewable energy?
No, that would be great. Yeah, make them islanded. Don't allow them to use the grid. Then they would be truly using renewable energy. But if they're going to use renewable energy that would otherwise be curtailed, that implies that they're grid connected and that they only operate when the grid doesn't need electricity and
Mm.
doesn't need that renewable electricity because it's in excess. That's largely an economic myth. I mean, people have been talking about that for ages, saying, well, what else are you going to do with all this wind and solar that's going to go to waste because it'll be generated when people don't need electricity? Oh, why not hydrogen? The problem that kills that idea is the capital cost. And I just explained to you in a previous comment why the capital cost of electrolysis isn't getting cheaper in the way that people expect it to get cheaper, or to the extent that some people dream that it will one day be cheap. And the problem is that even if electricity is free, but it's only free five or 10 or even 15% of the time, which by the way is the annualized capacity factor of solar alone here in Ontario, which is north of, south, sorry, of most of Germany, by the way. Uh, the the resulting hydrogen is extremely expensive. If you use expensive capital at low capacity factor, you get expensive hydrogen, even if the electricity were to be free. So
Yeah.
again, if there were a way to make electrolyzers for, $10 a megawatt, then maybe we've got a hope. But they're not $10 a megawatt; they're $2 million a megawatt. So
So, talking about the price, what hydrogen price point do you believe makes green steel cost competitive with conventional production?
no price of green hydrogen makes green steel competitive with black steel. That's not what it's doing. Okay. So what you really should be asking is what carbon tax level would make green steel competitive with black steel? And the answer to that is you would need, I would say, round numbers, $300 a ton of carbon tax, and you'd need a matching carbon tariff on imports because otherwise the Chinese will just ship you blast furnace steel made from coke in the normal way. So uh, yeah, it's green steel. Steel is a hard to decarbonize sector, but by the way, let's be clear: it's not steel; it's iron making. Okay, steel making.
Yeah.
70% of steel making in the United States is already electric. They already do it in electric arc furnaces. They use a mixture of scrap and fresh pig iron, or direct reduced iron pellets. And so what we're talking about using hydrogen for is making direct reduced iron, and that's a replacement of natural gas, not of coke. The process works; it can definitely be done, and there are some industries that are more sensitive to the ESG performance of their inputs than they are to the cost of steel because they consume honestly a trivial amount of steel. Those industries are interested in decarbonizing their steel use. But the people that are using the majority of steel, like people that are building buildings, for instance, where they're using steel in rebar and in structural shapes, they're not going to buy steel at the cost of decarbonized steel, uh, to the extent that, until somebody forces them to.
Yeah.
So it has to be driven by regulatory. It's not going to be driven by voluntary purchases. And if you're asking, how cheap would hydrogen have to get in order to make it break even with unabated fossils, the answer is there's no way it's even possible because black hydrogen doesn't it doesn't break even with unabated steel because steel's made using coke from coal, which is cheaper than gas. So
Yeah. You dismiss hydrogen for shipping, but acknowledge e-fuels
I
might
don't
be the
acknowledge
necessary
e-fuels.
for.
I don't acknowledge e-fuels at all, period. Well, I acknowledge that the idea of e-fuels exists. I also think that it's total nonsense. What I say is that shipping and aviation need liquid fuels. They're not feasible. Neither of them are feasible to fuel directly with hydrogen. And so, as a consequence, you need liquid fuels for those two applications. Transoceanic ships and transoceanic aircraft are not possible to battery electrify at current um, energy densities of batteries for aviation and at current costs per kilowatt hour for batteries. So, that means they need liquid fuels for the foreseeable future. The cheapest way to make those liquid fuels will be from biomass, not from green hydrogen. Now, you might use a bit of green hydrogen to do yield enhancement if you find that you're running a little short of biomass, or you're finding that the impacts of farming that much biomass are hard on things like food pricing, or you're worried about deforestation or some other concern. Those are all very valid concerns, but let's be real, we're replacing fossils here, and there's an imperative to replace them. E-fuels, on the other hand, are made from electricity and the combustion products of other fuels. And as a consequence, thermodynamics frowns on that very, very hard. Okay. So the notion that people are going to be capturing CO2 from the atmosphere using direct air capture at what, $700 a ton for the CO2, and then reducing that CO2 back to fuels with green hydrogen, I mean, give your head a shake. There's no way any of that's happening. The closest one that's the closest thing to feasibility would be to use biogenic CO2 that's produced, as an example, by the fermentation of grains to make ethanol, and reduce that with green hydrogen to make methanol, which you could use as a shipping fuel, because ships are basically energetic carburetors. They'll burn just about anything as long as it's a liquid. They don't want to have people or conveyors moving solid material around into the boilers. So, um, liquid fuel is a much better option for them, much more economic option for them. Otherwise, they would be burning coal still. But ships can use methanol. Methanol will be the cheapest of all those options. And I think honestly, it'll be even cheaper than ammonia, which other people are talking about as an alternative, even though it will kill people if it's applied in shipping. So I think using ammonia as a shipping fuel is insane. And I think the people that are pitching it are dangerous and shouldn't be trusted. But at the same time, aviation needs a very specific range of molecules, and making them from biomass, making them from some forms of biomass is actually quite easy. Making them from other forms of biomass takes a couple steps and will be quite costly. Making jet fuel from CO2 and water and electricity is just mad. It's I know those processes intimately. I've worked with them for decades. People talking about taking CO2 and then running reverse water gas shift on it with hydrogen and then feeding it to Fischer-Tropsch. They really need to give their heads a shake. I mean, anybody that's proposing that, they simply don't understand it, Fischer-Tropsch. That's all I can say. I understand it very well. I've built numerous Fischer-Tropsch units. A process that cannot make money except at gargantuan scale, even when given free natural gas. There's no way on earth it will ever make anything economic from CO2 and water and electricity. So people should just stop. Just stop with that. That's not earnest. It's
You
delusional.
just you just answered my next question, actually, but it's truly a gift to be able to translate all of this technical data into such understandable language, and
Well,
that
I'm
definitely
cleaner
shows.
than that in my LinkedIn commentary. I refer to Fisher-Tropsch has the acronym FT, and I say that the F stands for something much ruder, and the T stands for terrible. And let me be clear about this. So, Fischer-Tropsch is a process by which you hydrogenate carbon monoxide in order to make CH2 units, which link up in a chain to make hydrocarbons. That's a dumbed down version of it. The problem with this process is that although you can shift the process to try to make big molecules like C40 type molecules that are waxes, that are solids at room temperature, and then you can back crack those to shorter molecules in the jet fuel range using hydrogen. Um, Even when you're making, you force the process to make waxes, which is the sort of thing that Shell does, you still end up making a substantial fraction of your syngas into things like methane and ethane and propane and LPG type fractions. And those molecules in a decarbonized future are worthless. So the notion that you're going to run an FT unit and then grind up all of that LPG by running it back through a pre-reformer and then a reformer to make it back into syngas. That's just, you might as well start just shoveling your paper money into the front end of this process because that's how expensive it's going to be. It's the notion that you're going to sell just jet fuel from an FT unit is nuts. And the notion that you're going to build a new petroleum refinery type economy around the feedstocks of CO2 and water and electricity is equally nonsense. It just does not stand up to the even Fermi level economic evaluation.
Let's go back to the transport. Why not consider liquid organic hydrogen carriers?
For what? For moving
Uh,
hydrogen from Australia to Germany so that the Germans can
yeah,
burn it in power plants or what?
yeah,
So the use cases are what's important. So again, let's think about what you're really talking about, which is for some reason Germans need hydrogen. Why do they need hydrogen? Give me an example. Why would Germans need hydrogen to use in what application? And then I'll tell you what makes more sense than importing hydrogen from Australia via liquid organic hydrogen carriers. So, the liquid organic hydrogen carriers, their problem is the energy density per unit mass is terrible. So you have to ship a ship full of toluene, uh, full of methyl cyclohexane to Germany, and then dehydrogenate it to produce hydrogen. That's only 6% of the mass, and the other 94% is toluene, and that's got to be shipped back to Australia again in order to hydrogenate it again in order to make methyl cyclohexane again. Can you do that? Yeah. The problem is that the hydrogenation, which happens in Australia, where electricity is in excess, it generates heat. And the dehydrogenation, which has to happen in Germany, requires heat. And we're not
heat.
talking about 60 degrees C, we're talking about 350 degrees C to do that dehydrogenation. And you get a little bit of loss every time you do it. You're going to do a little bit of hydrocracking. You're going to lose a little bit of toluene or methyl cyclohexane to lights. As you do it, catalysts don't last forever. And these are not simple things. These are chemical plants that you have to run at both ends, right? So you have ships running back and forth and chemical plants at both ends. The end resulting hydrogen is going to be very expensive. So what are you going to use it for? Well, let's say that you realize that if you said heating or transport, I'm already going to go smack. Better thing with those is to do them electrically and cut out the molecular middleman or middlemen in this case. But let's say that you instead said, well, German farmers still need ammonia to use as a fertilizer. Well, the obvious thing to do is to make ammonia in Australia and ship it for use as a fertilizer. That's the logical thing to do. So the same thing, you could say, well, the Germans want to keep running their steel making operations, but they want direct reduced iron made with hydrogen to feed them. Sure, no problem. Germans should build electric arc furnaces, abandon their existing blast furnaces, and they should buy direct reduced iron that comes from Australia, where it can be made with a combination of wind and sun for a lower cost than anywhere else, probably on Earth. And the other places that are like that, they're all places that have um, anti-correlated wind and sun. So they get very high capacity factors of wind and sun together. Places with largely they're places that are deserts with oceans to the west. So Western Australia, Chile, parts of West Africa, Namibia is one popular location. There's some places in the north of Africa that are somewhat attractive as well. But again, capacity factors are not ideal there. And anywhere else is going to have to basically pay twice as much expensive capital for electrolyzers in order to make the same amount of hydrogen. So, the notion that you're going to import hydrogen to Germany to make ammonia to use in Germany, that's nuts. Why wouldn't you just make the ammonia and import it and use it as fertilizer? Or you're going to make steel in Germany, that's fine. But do the iron reduction where the ore is found, because there's no iron ore in Germany either. You have to import. Why would you import all that oxygen on all those iron atoms? Why wouldn't you just do the direct reduction where the ore and the renewable electricity are available plentifully, and then import the iron and use it to make your steel? The steel making is where all the technology is.
It sounds so simple,
Yeah, yeah,
so
it is.
simple that,
It is
you
that
know,
it is that simple. But the problem is that no one wants to enact the policy measures, the strictly enforced, bankable carbon taxes and emission bans that would be necessary to drive real decarbonization. What they want is for someone else to solve the problem at their cost. What they want is the conceptually simpler thing of being able to substitute one fuel with another. And that kind of thinking is answering the wrong question. As I've said many times before, when you ask the question, we can't burn fossils anymore, what else can we burn? You get the answer hydrogen, because when you burn hydrogen, you get water, but you also get NOx if you burn it in air. But anyway, let's forget about that for a moment. Um, you know, but it's the wrong question.
yeah.
The right question is, we can't burn fossils anymore. How do we deliver the energy services that we used to get by burning fossils without generating GHG emissions? And the answer to that question is almost never hydrogen. Hydrogen's largely not an energy vector today and won't be in the future, in my opinion. It's unlikely to be a substantial fraction of world um, energy use in the future. It is today, but largely for it's around the same emissions in GHG emissions terms as aviation plus about half of shipping. So that's not insignificant, but all of that hydrogen is used as a chemical. Some of it, about 30 million tons a year, is used to desulfurize fossils before we burn them. So, of course, that's going to come to an end, but we'll probably see that 30 million tons taken up by things like expansion of direct reduced iron, which is something that we are going to need to do in a decarbonized future. So, the goal ultimately needs to be electrify, green up electricity, and then electrify everything we can. And then if we haven't electrified everything, go back and try harder. And then when we're left over at the end, uh, we still have excess electricity left over, and it's very green. Then we should start thinking about making green hydrogen to replace black hydrogen. That's really the way that we should be thinking about it. It is that simple. There are lots of other people making it more complicated because they're earning a buck off of it one way or another. And yeah, I have hydrogen related clients, but I also have battery related clients, and I have people that would like to put my hydrogen related clients out of business with their technologies. And there's no client of mine, one way or another, that makes a difference to my opinion on these matters in terms of their financial influence over my opinions. If any client ever called me up and said, "Hey, can you stop talking so negatively about this or that thing because we're invested in it?" I would drop them in a millisecond. Uh, because what I'm selling is advice, and I have to be unfettered in the nature of the advice that I give in order for that advice to be worth what I'm charging for it to clients. So anybody sought to influence my opinion monetarily, I would just drop them. It would get me more clients rather than fewer.
So basically, they are still approaching you and working with you, of course, because you are giving them the right information.
Well, the hydrogen clients that I have are people that are, for instance, fully aware of the fact that they need to build electrolyzers at larger scale in order for them to be at all economic for industrial purposes. And they're, the smart people in that industry are thinking about these things, and they know that a world expert in scaling things, that's what I do. I've worked in chemical process development my entire career, and I understand very well what's involved in scaling up new technology. and what scale does and where it makes sense and where it doesn't, and what numbering up does and where it makes sense and where it doesn't. They come to people like me in order to give them advice about, for instance, how big should they make their electrolyzer packages? What should be in them? Should they be complete little subsystems with every single part twinned up at their or numbered up from that size upward, or should there be electrolyzers that are built in banks of a certain size, and then the balance of plant scaled up, and to what extent should it be scaled up, and what implications are there for the labor cost and the installation time and the borrowing for the capital and all those sorts of things. So those that's what those guys are coming to me about. But there are lots of other people that are trying to find niche applications or special use cases for making ammonia or making methanol or making hydrogen derived products. And so they're coming to me for that advice too. And I'm telling them, look, if your bet is on hydrogen as a fuel or hydrogen derived fuels, running aviation or shipping, then you should probably give your head a shake, because the economics there are really quite poor. And here are examples of how you can figure it out for yourself. Because I've done those calculations for clients for hire many, many times. I can't share the direct results because those are under confidentiality, but I can tell you the basic conclusion. And the basic conclusion you can figure out yourself at a Fermi level if you know what I know quite easily. And there are lots of people out there who know this but are pursuing it anyway.
But you do sound like you came from the future, because
Oh
everything
no,
that you actually
I was
predicted
I was
actually.
there in the past. I was there in the past. Remember, I was about to mention that one of the anecdotes that I love to bring up is that for years I was working on a project first for Texaco and then for Chevron after Chevron bought them through my former employer, and they were trying to make reformers to make hydrogen to feed fuel cells, very very small ones, tiny ones, and that was very challenging, very interesting work. And so there were many occasions where they'd fly me down to Houston, and I'd be sitting around a table with about 20 engineers and scientists, and we'd be talking about what was required in order to make these tiny reformers work. And then, the end of the day would come, and I'd have to go out for dinner because I was visiting, and a couple people would come along, and then eventually, after a few drinks, somebody, generally in a thick Texan drawl, would say, "Y'all realize this is horseshit, right?" And everybody would laugh. And because the person's finally said what everybody had been thinking, it's like, yeah, yeah, the thermodynamics are just nuts. Like, this is never going to make any sense. But we'll all be back at it tomorrow again, right? Because the boss is paying. And this
Yeah.
is the late 1990s. And I thought, when the electric vehicle came to the fore and lithium ion batteries were affordable enough that you could put them in vehicles, and they were getting cheaper and cheaper by the minute, that the whole hydrogen for transport thing would just die. It so obviously was dead at that point. It was dead in 2013 when the Nissan Leaf first hit the market. And watching it come back, watching it crawl out of the grave of dead ideas like a zombie, was just horrifying for me. It was like watching a horror movie, watching billions of dollars of largely public money being wasted on something that we knew already was a dead end. I couldn't let that stand without commenting on it. And so in 2017, I started commenting on it vigorously, and have been doing so ever since. And the reason is, like I said, if people, for years, I used to build pilot and demonstration scale plants for people. And because the analogy that I use is that we basically were people that sold shovels to people that were running off to various gold rushes in different parts of the world. And we made very good shovels. We were very good at making shovels. We were the world's best shovel maker in terms of pilot and demonstration scale plants. And we were very proud of that fact. And if our clients chose to dig in the wrong place, that wasn't our problem, right?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
couldn't fault the shovel if they didn't find gold where they were digging. And on occasion, somebody would come to me and say, "Hey, is buying a shovel a good idea?" And I would say, "Hold on a second. You realize I sell shovels, right? So if I sell you a shovel, I make money. And if I don't sell you a shovel, I don't. So why would you ask a guy that sells shovels whether or not you need a shovel and expect an honest answer. You probably should ask somebody else. And now I don't sell shovels anymore. In fact, I will call a spade a shovel, to use the English parlance. Because if I say spade, I might be talking about a particular kind of shovel, or I might be talking about cards, queen of cards. So no, I disambiguate now, and I make it very clear, and I don't derive any money from anything other than offering the advice. And so
Mm,
as a consequence, I'm perfectly happy to tell people, well, no, you shouldn't rush off to that gold rush, because in fact, when you dig there, you can find nothing but fool's gold. And here's
yeah.
why. And you're free to disagree with me with your own money, but as soon as you involve public money, that's where it gets worrisome. I've said many times, if people want to put their own money in a big pile on the floor and set fire to it, I'm okay with that, because people make bets all the time on all sorts of crazy things, and sometimes they turn out very well for them, and that's great. That's how capitalism works. I might even toss them a pack of matches to burn their own money if they wished, because if nothing else, they'll be generating economic activity, they'll be generating employment for engineers and scientists, and I'm okay with that. The problem is that often the money that's in the pile, more of it comes from taxes paid by people making goods and services of real value in the economy. And that is what worries me. Now, I support government using its economic power wisely to subsidize things where Wright's law applies, and building scale can cause costs to fall dramatically and rapidly. And that's exactly what we saw happen with solar and wind and batteries, and hence things that use batteries like electric vehicles. That proved the efficacy of that approach. But I'm very skeptical and hesitant about governments picking technological winners and losers, because they're so absolutely craptastic at doing it. They're terrible at it. What they should do instead is they should set the economic terms for success by, for instance, saying, if you're going to dump fossil CO2 or fossil methane into the atmosphere, it's no longer free. It now costs you lots of money. And when people do that, then they can go, well, I could keep driving my gasoline car and pay a ton
Yeah.
of money because gasoline's very expensive because of the carbon tax. Or I could buy an electric vehicle and have my operating costs drop. Which of those two am I going to pick? And then it very clearly becomes, it's very clear what the actual outcomes are. The cheapest solutions tend to be the ones that most directly involve electrification. And the ones that are left, we may have to trim with regulation, but then we won't have to do that very vigorously. It'll be just the last little bits that we'll have to trim by regulation.
That's very well said. The government who picks technological winners and losers, and actually that, doesn't sound good.
Well,
But
they
let,
pick they pick them on the basis of lobbying. Whoever screams the
yeah,
loudest,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's the problem. You get lone engineers out in the wilderness like me, and we're very few, very far between, because most people who know what I know are not free to talk about it because they're under gag orders from an employer or gag orders from a client or something else. And so they will tell me privately, by the way, you're bang on. Everything
Oh,
that you're saying is absolutely correct. But if you tell anybody else that I told you this, I'll deny it.
yeah. You wouldn't believe how many people wanted to talk to me, but they couldn't because of the company regulations, like
Absolutely.
company policies.
And what I found interesting, anybody that reads my articles on LinkedIn, which I would strongly suggest because no one's paying me to write them, they exist only to inform. You'll find that they all have a disclaimer on them. And the disclaimer says the following: this article has been written by a human, and humans are known to make mistakes from time to time. So if you find that I've made a math error or I've concluded something incorrectly and you have good data that shows that I'm wrong, then let me know, because I want to get the thing right. It's more important to me to get the thing right than to be right myself. And that's why I use LinkedIn, because you can edit it. It's not a stake driven into the sand that stays there forever. and then people turn around later and say, see, you were wrong. You can keep going back and go, oh, this thing changed, something changed, batteries got super cheap. Oh, the conclusions of this whole thing are now completely wrong because batteries are now cheap enough to make it work.
Yeah.
But the other part of the disclaimer says, but if the thing that makes you upset about my article is that I've taken a crap on your pet idea, the thing that you like, then please contact my employer, Spitfire Research, who will be happy to tell you to piss off and write your own article. And the reason that I say that is that in past, my former employer would be approached by certain people who would say, "Hey, can you shut that Paul Martin guy up? Because he's saying things contrary to our business interest, and we're a client of yours." And you know,
Yeah.
it was nice of them to try, I suppose. They never could because my public commentary on LinkedIn was always my own, and I always clearly differentiated it from my employer and said, "Look, don't blame these guys. They like to build pilot plants and they don't have opinions on these matters at all. Leave them alone. You got a problem, take it up with me." But people don't like to have people say things that are contrary to their business interests, and so they would try, you know.
Yeah.
And now they can try. They can call up my employer, which is me, right? And I will tell them to go piss off and write their own article if they don't agree with what I have.
So that
So
that
and that makes it crystal clear.
that actually overlaps with a lot of my story, but on some other occasion. But from the point of knowing the future, and you do seem like you know it. Where do you see the hydrogen, say in 5 to 10 years?
Sure, I
And
see it as
you know,
I see in 5 years, 99% of hydrogen in the world will still be made from fossils without carbon capture. And in 10 years, 95% of the hydrogen in the world will still be made from fossils without carbon capture. That's
so
where I see it.
you predict the total collapse of the industry in
No,
this.
the hydrogen industry will continue just as it is today. It's a $180 billion a year industry, all of which is
Sorry,
derived from fossils. So I would say
I
that the green hydrogen hyperbole
yeah.
won't die, but it'll get more and more focused on replacing black hydrogen with green hydrogen and for use cases that are inevitable because we need the properties of hydrogen as a molecule. And the whole hydrogen for energy, hydrogen economy hyperbole will go away.
So you took.
By go away, I don't mean die, okay? Because this idea is simple minded and seductive. It's like solar panels on cars, right? Crazy people will keep coming back. Well, isn't it so obvious we should just put solar panels on cars and electric cars, and then they'll be able to drive themselves? And you can't kill ideas like that because they're simple. They're seductive on a simple-minded level, and it's the same thing. Well, why don't we just burn hydrogen? It just makes water.
But
You
as
can't
long
kill it.
as
It'll
there's,
keep coming back, but it just won't be popular anymore.
but potentially as long as there's a funding from the governments, yeah.
Oh,
So
there are people pursuing, you know, wild and crazy things with no government funding. I encounter them weekly. I wrote an article called "What's the Problem with Over Unity?" as an example. And so the first law of thermodynamics says that energy is conserved. All the energy that you use is converted to heat. It doesn't disappear. It just gets transformed from one form to another. Energy is conserved, and that means that you can't arrange matter in a way that produces energy from nothing. No clever arrangement of wheels or magnets or coils of wire or whatever you wish will produce energy from nothing. There has to be an
yeah.
energy input. And yet there have been people forever, probably, and certainly since we started understanding thermodynamics, there have been lots and lots of people who have endeavored to come up with perpetual motion machines of either the first or the second kind. And people still pursue this, even though patents in the US on such devices will not be granted, uh, because lots of, believe me, there are patents on lots of things that don't work, but the US Patent Office just won't even entertain over Unity patents because they know that they don't. So
Yeah.
there's really no public interest benefit provided to providing exclusive right to make a non-functional thing
Yeah.
to a particular party.
Let's go back to some other things I wanted to talk to you about. You mentioned temporal matching issues between renewable generation and electrolyzer operation.
Yep.
What storage duration would make grid-connected electrolyzers viable in your view?
What storage duration? Well, okay, the reason that people are building electrolyzers that are connected to the grid is to have no storage or to have a minimal amount of storage. And the
Yeah.
reason for that is that when you look at what it costs to store hydrogen, uh, except if you happen to have the very fortunate situation of being right next door to an existing salt cavern that hasn't been used for anything else, you know, uh, which basically is a non-existent condition. The cost of hydrogen storage is so astronomical that they really don't want to have to store hydrogen. When they often they'll think about it and they'll say, "Oh, we can build an islanded project. We'll just have to store some hydrogen." And then they run the numbers and they go, "Oh crap! Hydrogen storage is actually really expensive. How do we not have to store hydrogen? Because our downstream equipment needs hydrogen all the time. We don't want to turn it on and off. What's the optimal amount of storage? The optimal amount of storage is zero,
Yeah.
right? So now the electrolyzers, they may wish to curtail their operation during periods of peak electrical consumption because they'll actually get more money back than if they were to just run them and use them to make hydrogen. But and they may mitigate that tendency with some storage, and they may do some economics back and forth to try to make that pencil out. But the fundamental problem here is still the capital. If you buy capital equipment and you run it at 30% of its capacity, it had better be cheap. Otherwise, the thing that you're making with it will not be cheap. And
Mm.
there's your fundamental problem. The capital, even if the electricity that you're feeding were free, and wind and solar are not free. They're inexpensive, but they're not free. Even if they were free, but they're only available at a small capacity factor, the capital cost of electrolyzers and the balance of the hydrogen plant and the future likely cost of that equipment are too high to make it pencil out. The resulting hydrogen is still a multiple of the cost of the hydrogen that it would have to replace. So the only thing that's going to drive that into economic existence is very high carbon taxes. And when you put those carbon taxes in place, then you find that there's actually way cheaper ways for people to reduce emissions, like buying electric vehicles, for instance. So a lot of the hydrogen hyperbole evaporates when electrification is properly monetized, when it's properly motivated by virtue of putting in place the policy measures that drive it.
Mm. Um, let's go on a big picture a little bit more granular. Many oil and gas majors are pivoting toward hydrogen. Do you see this as primarily defensive positioning or genuine strategic transformation?
Well, I take issue with the notion of many. I think that there have been uh, oil and gas majors that have flirted with hydrogen for a long time. Uh, they know a lot about hydrogen already, so they're kind of inoculated against some of the hyperbole. But they're often dragged in that direction by the dangling of huge subsidies like the U.S. IRA subsidies that are put in place. Most of the sincere plays by the natural gas industry or the oil and gas industry are related to quote unquote blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen
Mm.
produced with carbon capture and storage used to dump the resulting CO2. We know what that costs, by the way, because a large project was done burying 1 million tons of CO2 per year under near ideal conditions. It was built by Shell, Fluor designed it on behalf of Shell. So these are very competent companies. The scale is large, and the a million tons of CO2 a year is nothing to sniff at. So nobody can say, oh, well, it wasn't big enough, so its marginal capital cost was too high. And the beauty of this project is that it was paid for by the Canadian and Alberta taxpayer. So the data from the project is public. So we know what it costs. And it currently costs $165 Canadian per ton of CO2 emissions averted. And that cost isn't falling, it's rising. Now, why is it
Yeah.
rising? It's rising because it takes energy to capture and dry and compress CO2, and that energy cost is rising. So we know what it costs at scale. Anybody that turns around and says, "Oh, don't worry about it. We know how to do it better than those other guys do. We'll be able to do it for $50 a ton." You know,
And on that point, exactly the next question: which hydrogen technology companies do you believe are pursuing the most scientifically sound approaches aligned with, say, your vision of hydrogen's
sure,
proper role?
sure. Well, that's a really good question, and nobody asked me that question, honestly. So congratulations for finding one that people don't ask. Uh, I would put
Thank
it this way. I would say that every company that makes hydrogen or wants to make hydrogen or fancies itself a hydrogen company can't help itself but get involved in the hydrogen hyperbole epidemic. They just can't help themselves. Even the smart ones, even the ones that are, privately, they'll say, look, you don't believe it. Right?
Guys, this is not the John Stewart show. This is the serious show
The, the
about energy.
CEO, the CEOs will be out there. Hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. We're going to be using it. It's the best thing since sliced bread. It's the most abundant element in the universe. Blah blah blah. Right? And but despite that, there are some people that are thinking about it more rationally, smarter, and have better approaches than others. Now, I will give an example of a hydrogen company that's not a hydrogen company as the first one, and that is Monolith Materials. So, Monolith Materials, what they do is they pyrolyze methane to make carbon black, and the byproduct of doing so is hydrogen, which they are, I think, quite intelligently using to make ammonia. And they've situated themselves such that they can truck the product, carbon black, around to whoever needs it, and they don't have to truck it very far because their plant is within a 100-mile radius of 40% of the ammonia users in the United States. And their primary product, three-quarters of the mass of the feedstock and half the energy content of the feed is carbon black, which itself is more valuable than hydrogen. If you make the right grade of it, it's used to reinforce rubber and plastics, and it's more valuable than hydrogen. So they're a hydrogen company who are not a hydrogen company. They're making hydrogen as a byproduct, and yet they have about 20 copycats out there and some of them are smart. They're saying, oh, well, we can make another, not carbon black, but another carbon product that is valuable, and we can make hydrogen as a byproduct, and those guys are okay, and some of them are my clients. Although not all of them are I always have to go back and check the agreements, which ones will allow me to speak about them publicly and which ones won't. But then there are a few out there, largely who are not my clients because they know my position on this matter, who think that they can just throw away the carbon because throwing away carbon will be cheaper than throwing away CO2. If you have to bury the CO2, and they can make money off the hydrogen. And I think those guys have a rather steep economic cliff to climb. And I don't think that, my bet is that none of them will climb that cliff ever.
Yeah.
So, as to among the usual suspects, who do I like? Do I like, Cummins, who bought Hydrogenics here in Ontario? No, no. Do I like Ballard? No. Double plus. Uh, those guys have basically evaporated $1.3 billion over the past 20 years. They have never made a profit, and almost all of that money came from taxpayers here, there, and the world. Uh, are there any among the usual players that I think are further advanced than others? Well, I don't want to talk out of turn. I think that there are some of the electrolyzer manufacturers are smarter than others. Some are betting on new technologies that have yet to be proven. But if they're proven, they could be really quite good. Some of them are getting good advice about the scale, so that they can actually make their electrolyzers bigger in bigger packages that will have lower marginal cost of hydrogen production when they're done. Um, I'm not bullish. I would say that I'm not generally bullish or as bullish about solid oxide electrolyzers as some people are. I think some people think that they're magic because they're very electricity efficient, because they actually convert some energy in the form of heat, which they hope that they're going to get for free from somewhere, in order to make hydrogen for lower energy input. Those people I don't think have really demonstrated a product that is low enough in capital cost and durable enough in order uh, to make that electricity savings worthwhile. But there is one that I can mention, and that is, and I can mention them because I'm involved with them as an advisor, and I have their permission. But also because I'm involved in a venture capital fund that one of their investments is in this company. They're called Peregrine Hydrogen, and their approach is to make hydrogen as a byproduct of making sulfuric acid, or vice versa. So they make both sulfuric acid and hydrogen at the same time, and they do so for about half the electricity that's required to make hydrogen from water.
Yeah.
Those guys, I think, are onto something, and I wish them the best of luck. But anytime that you bite off a hard problem, like how do you make a commodity like hydrogen or sulfuric acid and do it in a way that's decarbonized and also cheaper, uh, the deck is stacked against you. It's hard stuff, right? Because you have to do these things at scale, otherwise, there's no way to make money. So even great ideas can fail in this space. It's rather like flow batteries. Like, I love the concept of flow batteries, but the problem with flow batteries is that they lack a path to scale. They don't. It's not like there are microelectronics users who are willing to pay you, $1,000 a kilowatt hour for the first flow battery that you make,
Yeah.
like we're with lithium-ion batteries in the beginning. So your path to scale is basically, hey, give me $1 billion, and if your path to scale is, trust me, give me $1 billion and I'll make a cheap battery at the end, chances are you're not going to make it. Now you might, but chances are you won't. So those guys, I'm always, when I'm advising startups and people with new technology, I always ask that question: what's your path to scale? And they go, huh? And I'll explain to them what I mean. And if they don't have one, chances are they're not going to succeed.
Yeah. While you're in a positive mood, what specific changes to hydrogen subsidies would you better align these incentives with your vision of
Sure.
hydrogen
Oh yeah.
proper
Oh,
growth?
again a really good one. I don't think we should subsidize hydrogen production at all. I think what we should do is we should tax emissions and then see where the money ends up going. So I don't honestly. I think greening up existing black hydrogen production is very important, but it's kind of a third tier thing. It has to
Yeah.
be behind greening up electricity production and behind the electrification of everything that we can manage to electrify. So what I would do is I would get rid of all of the incentives. I would kill it all. I would fund R&D of a fundamental nature. So people that are working on making better electrolyzers and fuel cells, sure, if you can put together a good proposal that explains why your approach makes more sense than other people's, or why it's pushing, the boundaries of science further, then by all means, but not, you know, subsidies for the, like, so many dollars a kilogram like they're doing in the US IRA or the Canadian matching tax credit program. I think those programs are completely wrong-headed, and they miss the point, because I don't think that they will actually drive any kind of rights law savings. So if the destination is getting $12 per kilogram green hydrogen down to $6, I don't see the point.
Yeah.
Like, why would you pay billions of public money to do that? There's just no point in doing that. There are much cheaper things you could do per ton of CO2 emissions, and we should put money into them in earnest.
And still have no guarantees that it will actually happen.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Still have no, and in fact, have people like me saying, here's why it won't happen or why it's unlikely to happen. Not won't. I mean, I don't discredit the possibility that somebody could come up with some new catalyst that would just, totally revolutionize the way that fuel cells operate and get their efficiency to go up from the current 50 to 60%, best case up to like 65 or 70. But that's not enough to make a difference if you see what I mean, right? And
Yeah.
those are mature technologies. Electrolysis, quite mature technology, quite efficient as far as things go. But its problem is that even if it's perfectly efficient, it's less efficient than a hardware store electric heater, because a hardware store electric heater will convert electricity into heat with at whatever temperature you want, with an efficiency of 100%.
Yeah. How should a life cycle carbon accounting methods for hydrogen production be reformed to better reflect real world emissions? And that's going in the same direction as previous question, actually your answer.
Yeah, really good question. What you're asking is what sort of yeah, what sort of question? Sorry, the question that you're really asking is what sort of provision should be put on existing hydrogen subsidies in order to make sure that they're really um, economic, and they produce greenhouse gas emission benefits, real greenhouse gas emission benefits that are durable and not a greenwash. And the answer to that is that you have to start with the use case, as I mentioned before, and I keep coming back to this, but green hydrogen used for a dumb use case isn't green. Okay. But let's say that you've got a good use case. You're going to make ammonia, and your intention is to make ammonia to replace black ammonia for use in fertilizers so we can keep eating. Well, I support eating, maybe a little bit too much. So I can't be against people making hydrogen to make ammonia to displace black ammonia from the marketplace for use as a fertilizer. So, what provisos should be in place to make sure that their hydrogen is actually green? Well, you can't go far wrong with the three principles of electrolysis, um, of green hydrogen production by electrolysis, which are the electricity needs to be additive, it needs to be new wind and solar. And I would add to that, there can't be the possibility or the probability of economically adding any more wind and solar to the local grid. Because if there can be, that's what you should do with that wind and solar. Number two, it has to be proximate, meaning you can't claim that you're going to buy electricity in Washington state for a project in Kentucky, right? It has to be nearby. You can't have a power purchase agreement for electrons that will never flow the distances involved. Number three, it has to be temporally matched, which means that you can't use the grid as if it were a battery when the grid doesn't actually have batteries involved. So you can't make electricity at night in order to run an electrolyzer during the day unless you also have a battery. Using grid electricity to do that invariably drives up the carbon intensity of the local grid and makes the resulting hydrogen in marginal terms not green. So those are very important, but the focus again must be on the use case. Even if you make the most perfect, green as can be, additive, temporally matched, and proximate renewable hydrogen, and you use it for a dumb use case like heating or transport, you're not doing the world a service.
Yeah. I've read your comments on ammonia, and to be honest, I was scared. So my my next question actually comes from that. What safety regulations would you recommend for ammonia transport if it gains traction as a hydrogen carrier?
Okay, so two different things. Number one, talking about so actually three different things. Number one, talking about moving ammonia around in the world as a cargo. We do know how to do that right now. We move about 8% of ammonia as anhydrous ammonia around as a cargo by ship. We know how to do that. We know how to do that safely. Uh, that'll need to expand in a decarbonized future because the green energy to make that ammonia exists in different places in the world than the agriculture that needs that ammonia. So that's a problem which largely has been solved, and we can make it safer and we can make it adequately safe, and it's a problem that's worth solving. Okay. The second one is moving ammonia around as a way to either use it as a fuel or to use it as a hydrogen carrier. I think both of those ideas are non starters, but moving ammonia around as a hydrogen carrier is a non starter because of economics, and I don't think it'll go anywhere. Moving ammonia around as a way to use ammonia as a fuel, for instance, as a bunker fuel for shipping, that on a per joule basis, ignoring the safety precautions that might be required, ammonia might be cheaper than methanol, than truly biogenic methanol will be. And so that's why people have been pushing this notion of using ammonia as a shipping fuel. But the problem there is that it fails the first principle of safety in design. The first principle of safety in design is if there's a safer alternative that's feasible, you use that. You don't try to make the more dangerous thing safer by putting safeguards on it, right? So we have a choice. We have methanol. Methanol is a toxic liquid, but it's a liquid at room temperature, and its toxicity is largely as a result of you drinking it. So as long as we denature it, put biturant in it, and whatever to make sure that people don't end up drinking it, largely the hazards associated with methanol are the same as the hazards for any fuel, right? I mean, gasoline's toxic too. People don't drink it. So the methanol is definitely feasible, but the reason people are pursuing ammonia instead of methanol is that ammonia might be cheaper. The trouble is that it's a toxic and corrosive gas. I mean, it's basically like a chemical warfare agent. It's that toxic. It's that nasty. And the notion of using that as an open system uh, feedstock, a fuel for use in ships or other engines, is just insane. Because ammonia used as a closed system refrigerant in ice rinks, for instance, kills people every single year. The worst chemical accident in Houston's history was an ammonia tanker on the highway.
Mm.
And the injuries involved are devastating. It not only kills people, it also like permanently destroys people's lives without killing them.
Yeah.
And anyone that's pushing that idea, they really need to ask themselves if they'll be able to sleep at night the first time an entire crew loses its lives at sea as a result of a ship's fuel leak.
Yeah.
Because at sea there's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide out from this stuff. So yeah, I think the notion of using ammonia as a shipping fuel is mad. I don't think engineers in good conscience should be offering it, and I think regulators should basically not permit it because it's crazy. It's like using chlorine as a fuel.
Let's go back to recommendations. How should regions with excellent renewable resources but poor grid connections approach hydrogen development?
Okay, so I would put it another way. I would say how should regions of the world that have huge wind and solar at high capacity factor
Yeah.
potential, but nobody nearby who needs electricity. By
Yeah.
nearby, I mean within the reasonable distance of an HVDC cable to reach somebody that needs electricity. As an example, Western Australia, perfect example. How should they make money? And the way they should make money is they should be making green, energy intensive products like ammonia and green steel to sell to a world which should, the rest of the world should, and in fact must, have the carbon taxes and emission bans in place necessary to push the black versions of ammonia and steel out of the way so that the green ones can compete. So that's what we should be doing. We should be making steel or iron, direct reduced iron, and ammonia, and methanol, and aluminum, and magnesium, and any number of other things that are very electricity intensive in places where electricity is very green and nobody needs electricity. That makes logical sense. But even those things, which will all be more expensive than the things that they replace, because the things that they replace today are using the atmosphere as a free public sewer for the effluent from fossil burning. Um, Even those places will not be able to make those replacement green alternative materials and chemicals if the world doesn't push fossils out of the market. Fossils, unabated fossils will be cheaper, period.
Yeah. So this is like going back to the regulations. I had uh actually I had more questions, but I was going to conclude with the next one. But before that, your take on natural hydrogen. I think that's
Yeah,
really
I
important.
mean, Arnoud Everts is the person to talk to about natural hydrogen. My feeling is that natural hydrogen is a gold rush. Um, the reality of it is that there's one well in Mali that's producing a tiny fraction of the output of a single wind turbine. But there are lots of people who think there's more. I wish them good luck in finding it. Um, when they find it, they have to find it in quantity and at a density and under conditions where it's monetizable. I think that will be challenging. I don't preclude it from being a possibility, but I don't think that the millions of holes in the world that we've drilled for mineral exploration and for oil and gas production and water and all the others have strategically missed huge amounts of hydrogen that just happen to be laying around all over the place. I just don't think that that's the case. So I think this is largely um, a gold rush that will, turn up maybe very little. I hope I'm wrong, but the other thing that I'm a little concerned about, in fact, more than a little, is that a little bit of natural hydrogen will be used to greenwash a large amount of fossil gas. So if hydrogen comes up at 20% in methane, is that natural hydrogen anymore? No, it's natural gas with a little hydrogen in it.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make the natural gas clean to burn it.
And I'm again going back to your gift to explain these things so simply. Finally, if you had to allocate 10 billion in hydrogen funding tomorrow, what specific projects and applications would you prioritize and why? And also, I'm going to add to this question, who are the people and companies you would promote to serve, say, a global hydrogen council?
Um, hmm. Okay, so two separate questions. First question is, how would I spend $1 billion on hydrogen and not feel
10
bad?
billion.
Yeah, 10 billion, whatever, a billion, 10 billion, it doesn't matter. Uh, it's all somebody else's money, right? So, uh, I wouldn't, I wouldn't do it. I would
Yeah.
recommend against it because I really don't see the the point of making structurally uneconomic green steel, for instance, or green ammonia, ahead of our willingness to make the black analogs cost too much.
Yeah.
So, I guess if pressed, I would say, well, it would have to be green hydrogen to replace black hydrogen. It's the only thing that makes sense for uses that are durable post decarbonization. So it can't be related to fossil fuel production or desulfurization. It can't be related to using hydrogen for heating or transport. It has to be for something like making ammonia or making green direct reduced iron. So it would have to be something like that. I guess if pressed, if you said, look, I've got $10 billion Even better, it's $10 billion of, say, Elon Musk's money or the like. And instead, if you don't spend it on hydrogen, he's going to spend it supporting Trump. Then I would say, okay, well, let's build a giant direct reduced iron and ammonia complex in Western Australia using wind and solar, and that would be a good use for it. As far as who would I put on a council to advise policymakers in relation to hydrogen, it would have to be some scientists and engineers who don't have any money riding on the thing one way or another, and who are likely to give good advice. And so what that means is it would disqualify having members who actually, run or are invested in a big way in hydrogen companies. So if you have large numbers of shares in Ballard or Cummins or ThyssenKrupp or one of those companies, then or even Air Liquide or somebody like that, then you really shouldn't be part of that council. That advice can be solicited under controlled conditions to ensure that it's not the tail doesn't wag the dog, so to speak, so that you don't get that being, uh, here, give us lots of money and we'll solve your problems kind of situation that seems to be going
Yeah.
on. And I'll tell you that Jorgo Chattomatakis guy would be nowhere to be seen.
So it would be my pleasure to host you two in a debate.
Oh, Jorgo wouldn't stand a chance. I'd shred him. I'd shred him at least as well as Michael Liebrecht did.
So who knows? Maybe he dares. Paul, thank you so much for being my guest today. It was an honor
Well, you're
and a
very
huge
welcome.
lesson.
You asked some good questions, so and I appreciate the opportunity to give the answers. And finally, I would like to say that I've said, in the interest of time, some things that sound like opinion that were stated as if they were fact, and that's just because that's how these things go. Never believe anyone, including me, on that basis. You should refer to spitfireresearch.com or go to my LinkedIn profile. If you just Google Paul Martin Spitfire, you'll find me right away. And read my articles there and see if you find them compelling. And if you don't, then engage in the discussion in the comments to those articles on LinkedIn, because that's how I get my feedback. And I get peer review from people like, as you mentioned, that's how I met all of those people that we talked about before. That's how I met George Verberg, as an example. It's how I met Tom Baxter and David Sibon and Bernard Van Dyke and Arnoud Everts and a wide variety of others who know about these issues deeply, who care about decarbonization and want only for us to make the world a better place, and don't want us betting on dead ends.
Thank you.
Looking to amplify your brand in the hydrogen energy sector? Welcome to H2 Energy News, your go-to platform for impactful industry insights. Every month, we connect with over 80,000 visitors and generate more than 251,000 page views. Our reach is unmatched, with over 1.2 million web impressions and a loyal social media following of 9,000 plus. Our newsletter reaches 77,000 plus subscribers, decision makers, industry leaders, and innovators. Want to target specific markets? Our geo-targeting capabilities cover Europe, the United States, and the MENA region. We reach key stakeholders, 27% senior executives, 32% directors, and 20% owners and partners. H2. Energy News isn't just a news platform, it's where the hydrogen energy community converges to shape the future. Join us and let's make an impact together. Visit energynews.biz and take your brand to the next level.